What happens when one of the world's sharpest comedians sits down with a host who never lets anyone else have the last word? In just 34 seconds, a light-hearted chat turned into one of the most explosive moments in talk show history, ending with a guest being thrown off, set in front of millions of stunned viewers. Ricky Gervais had walked onto that stage expecting a typical interview. He'd done hundreds before. Talk a little about comedy, crack a few jokes, promote his latest project, and go home. Easy. Routine. But what he got instead was something entirely different. A conversation that would spiral out of control faster than anyone could have imagined. Across from him sat Piers Morgan, wearing that trademark smirk. The one that said he was already planning his next interruption. The kind of smirk that made most guests nervous before they even spoke. But Ricky wasn't most guests. He'd roasted presidents, billionaires, and A-list celebrities in front of live audiences. A talk show host was nothing. At first, it all seemed normal. Piers asked about Ricky's comedy, his career, cancel culture, the usual questions. Ricky answered with wit and precision. The audience laughed. Everything seemed fine. Then Piers did what Piers always does. He pushed. "You know what your problem is?" he said, leaning forward with that condescending tone that made producers hold their breath. "You think you're the smartest person in the room." Ricky laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a genuine one. The irony was too perfect. Here was Piers Morgan, a man famous for interrupting his own guests, accusing someone else of arrogance. "That's rich coming from you," Ricky said, still smiling. "Mate, you've spent your entire career telling other people what to think." The audience let out that collective ooh, the sound of a verbal knockout. Piers didn't like that. You could see it. The jaw tightening, the eyes narrowing. He was used to landing the blows, not taking them. "I'm a journalist," Piers snapped. "I ask tough questions. I hold people accountable. That's my job?" "Right," Ricky said, nodding slowly. "And how'd that work out at that tabloid you ran? You know, before all the phone hacking stuff came out?" Silence. Complete suffocating silence. Ricky had gone there. Straight for the one topic Piers never wanted mentioned. The scandal that had shadowed his career for years. "We're not talking about that," Piers said quickly, his voice tight. "We're talking about you and your comedy." "No," Ricky replied calmly. "You brought up credibility. You brought up accountability. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about the journalists who hacked phones and invaded privacy. Let's talk about that." "That has nothing to do with this interview." Piers barked, his volume rising. He was rattled, visibly losing his grip. "It has everything to do with it," Ricky said evenly. "You sit there acting like a moral authority, but your own past is questionable at best. You love judging everyone else, but you can't handle being judged yourself." The crowd was dead silent now. No laughter, no movement. Just tension, thick and electric. Piers' hands clenched around the armrests. His face was flushed. "You don't know what you're talking about," he growled. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Ricky said. "And so does everyone watching. That's what bothers you. Not that I said it, but that everyone knows it's true." That was the breaking point. Piers suddenly stood up, the chair scraping back with a screech. He pointed at Ricky, his finger trembling. "I will not sit here and be disrespected on my own show. Not by you or anyone else," he shouted. Ricky didn't move. He stayed seated calm, almost compassionate. "Mate," he said quietly, "I haven't disrespected you. I've just stopped pretending you're something you're not. There's a difference." And that was it. The moment Piers Morgan lost total control. He turned off camera, gesturing sharply to the producers. "Get him out of here," he barked. "Get him off my set, now." 2 producers rushed in, exchanging nervous glances. No one moved at first. This was live television. Millions were watching. And for a long, charged moment, Ricky Gervais just sat there, composed, unbothered, as Piers Morgan's empire of control unraveled before the world. Throwing a guest off mid-interview wasn't just rare. It was unthinkable, but Piers Morgan wasn't backing down. "I said get him out," he shouted, his voice cracking through the studio like a whip. Ricky stood slowly, brushing off his jacket with unhurried precision. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look rattled. If anything, he looked entertained. Like this was exactly how he expected the night to end. Like Piers had just confirmed everything he'd accused him of. "Well," Ricky said, glancing straight into the camera, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I guess we know who the real snowflake is, don't we?" The audience erupted. Some laughed, some gasped, others applauded, unsure if they were watching live television or the slow-motion implosion of a man's ego. Piers stood center stage, red-faced and trembling, barking, "Out! Out!" again like a man trying to reassert control over something that was already gone. Ricky started walking toward the edge of the stage, slow, almost leisurely, as if he had all the time in the world. The two producers followed behind, unsure whether they were escorting him out or simply caught in the wreckage of live chaos. When he reached the steps, Ricky turned back one last time. "Thanks for having me, Piers," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "This has been absolutely delightful." And with that, he walked off set, calm, composed, and undefeated. Piers Morgan stood frozen in place, surrounded by the sound of scattered laughter, whispers, and uncertainty. He finally sank into his chair, running a hand through his hair, his face the color of a warning light. He stared into the camera, desperate to steady his breathing, desperate to salvage something. "Well," he said, forcing a shaky chuckle, "that was unfortunate. Ricky Gervais, ladies and gentlemen. A man who clearly can't handle a real conversation. But no one was buying it. Not the audience. Not the crew. Not the millions watching at home. Because everyone had just seen the same thing. The host who lost control. The man who couldn't take the heat. The self-proclaimed truth-teller who couldn't handle being told the truth. Piers tried to move on. He introduced the next segment. Some hollow bit about celebrity gossip. But the energy was gone. The show was a corpse, and everyone knew it. He spoke mechanically, glancing at the clock, counting the seconds until the broadcast ended. But let's rewind for a moment, back to the beginning of this interview, because if you knew where to look, you could see it coming. The storm didn't start when Ricky fired back. It started the moment he walked onto that stage. The handshake, the forced smile. The two bright lights. Piers had looked nervous even then, like a man about to debate his own reflection. Maybe he'd heard the stories. Maybe he'd watched Ricky dismantle politicians, actors, executives. Anyone foolish enough to pretend they were untouchable. Or maybe it was something simpler, something raw. Jealousy. Ricky was sharper, funnier, more respected. And Piers Morgan hates nothing more than a man he can't control. The first few questions were softballs. Career, projects, fame. Ricky hit them with ease, tossing in quick one-liners that had the audience roaring. Piers laughed too. But it was that host's laugh, the hollow kind, the one that fills silence instead of joy. Then came the pivot, the moment when charm turned to challenge. "So tell me," Piers said, leaning back in his chair, that familiar smirk returning. "Do you ever worry your comedy goes too far? That maybe you cross lines that shouldn't be crossed?" It was the kind of question designed to corner someone, not to understand them. Ricky recognized it instantly. He'd heard it before. He'd dismantled it before. "No," he said simply. Silence. Piers blinked, waiting for more. Waiting for Ricky to explain himself. But Ricky didn't. He sat comfortably in the pause, letting Piers squirm. "That's it?" Piers finally said. Just no? What else do you want me to say? Ricky replied, amused. You asked if I worry. I don't. I think about what I say, sure. But worry? No, I know my line. I know my intent. And if someone doesn't get it, that's their problem, not mine. Piers leaned forward, seizing what he thought was an opening. But don't you have a responsibility? He pressed. As someone with influence. A responsibility to who? Ricky shot back. To you? To people who were never going to find me funny anyway. My responsibility is to be honest, not to make everyone comfortable. So you don't care if you offend people? Piers challenged. I didn't say that, Ricky replied. I said I don't worry about crossing lines. Of course I care about people's feelings. I'm not a psychopath. But I also won't let the most sensitive person in the room decide what everyone else is allowed to laugh at. Piers's smirk faded slightly. He wasn't used to this kind of calm defiance. But who decides what's okay to joke about? He asked, his tone sharpening. Who gets to make that call? The person telling the joke, Ricky said without missing a beat. That's how comedy works. That's how free speech works. And right there, in that calm, unshakable tone, was the spark that lit the fuse. Because Piers Morgan wasn't interested in comedy, or freedom, or nuance. He was interested in control, and Ricky Gervais had just taken it away from him. You say something, people react, and then we all move on, Ricky said calmly. Nobody dies. Nobody goes to prison. Life keeps going. But some things shouldn't be joked about. Piers shot back, his voice taking on that sanctimonious weight he was known for. Some topics are too serious, too painful, too important. According to who? Ricky asked, leaning forward. According to most reasonable people, Piers said stiffly. Ah, right. According to you, Ricky replied, the faintest grin playing at his lips. See, that's the problem with your whole argument. You want to decide what's acceptable. You want to be the one drawing the line. But you don't get to do that. Nobody does. That's not how this works. A ripple of applause broke out from the audience. Not everyone, but enough to make the air shift. Enough for Piers to notice. His jaw tightened, his eyes flicking toward the crowd with that flicker of irritation he couldn't quite hide. I'm not trying to be an arbiter of anything, Piers said defensively. I'm just saying there are things that most decent people agree are off limits. Name one, Ricky challenged. Piers hesitated. The silence stretched, long enough for the audience to feel it. Then finally, well, mocking someone's disability, for instance. That's cruel and unnecessary. Sure, Ricky nodded, if your intent is to be cruel. But what if the joke isn't about the person? What if it's about society's reaction to disability? What if the point is to challenge prejudice through humor? Does that still make it off limits? It depends on how you do it, Piers said, trying to steady himself. Exactly, Ricky shot back, pointing toward him. It depends on context, intent, execution. Which means there are no hard rules. Which means you can't just declare a line in the sand and say, nothing beyond this is allowed. Comedy's complex. It's messy, and people like you want to make it simple, because simple is easier to control. People like me? Piers repeated, his voice rising. What's that supposed to mean? People who think they should decide what everyone else can think, say, or laugh at. Ricky said evenly. People who dress up control as compassion. That was when Piers first stood up. Not the final time. That came later. But the first moment his composure visibly cracked, he began pacing, voice tight with anger. I find it fascinating, Piers sneered, that you of all people are lecturing me about control. You, who throws a tantrum every time someone criticizes your work. You who block anyone on social media who disagrees with you. You want to talk about not handling opinions? Please. Ricky laughed genuinely. Mate, blocking someone on Twitter isn't censorship. It's self-care. I'm not getting anyone fired. I'm not silencing them. I just don't want to read nonsense all day. There's a difference. So anyone who criticizes you is an idiot? Piers said, thinking he'd caught him. No, Ricky said patiently, almost kindly. Thoughtful criticism. Fine, welcome even. But bad faith attacks, lies, deliberate misquotes. I don't need that in my life. And neither do you. I've seen your Twitter feed, mate. You block people all the time. That's different, Piers snapped. How? Ricky asked, eyes narrowing slightly. How is it different when you do it? Piers froze. He didn't have an answer. The silence stretched again, heavy and unmistakable. The audience could feel it, could see it. They were with Ricky now, nodding, murmuring. And that's when Piers made his fatal mistake. The moment he could have laughed, diffused the tension, moved on. But instead he doubled down. The difference, Piers said slowly, his tone sharp, is that I actually matter. I'm a real journalist. I've broken major stories. I've interviewed world leaders. You're just a comedian, a man who tells jokes for a living. So when I block someone, it's because I don't have time for nonsense. When you block someone, it's because you can't handle criticism. The studio fell utterly silent. The arrogance in his words hung in the air like smoke. Even his own audience seemed stunned. You could have heard a pin drop. Ricky sat there saying nothing, just looking at Piers. Eyes steady, expression unreadable, as if deciding whether to respond at all. And then, slowly, a smile crept across Ricky's face. Not a warm smile, not even smug, but the kind of quiet, knowing smirk that said, "Game over." You think you're better than me? He said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. You actually believe what you do matters more than what I do. That journalism, or whatever that is, carries more value than comedy. It does, Piers said bluntly. Comedy is entertainment. Journalism is truth. Truth? Ricky repeated, laughing under his breath. You want to talk about truth, mate? Let's talk about the number of times you've been wrong. The stories you've printed that turned out to be lies. The half-truths. The quiet retractions. The public apologies that came after the damage was already done. You act like you're a guardian of truth, but your records, well, let's call it patchy. Everyone makes mistakes, Piers said defensively. Right, Ricky replied. Everyone does. But when I make a mistake, I tell a bad joke. When you make a mistake, you ruin someone's life. You smear reputations. You call it journalism, but it's just drama with consequences. So maybe get off your high horse before lecturing anyone about importance. Piers was trembling now, actually shaking, fists clenched, face turning crimson. How dare you? He hissed, his voice low and dangerous. How dare you come on my show and talk to me like that? How dare I? Ricky echoed, standing up as well. The air between them thickened, the small table feeling suddenly like a border in a war zone. You invited me here. You took the first shot. You said I didn't matter. So don't act surprised when I push back. This is my show, Piers roared. Mine! And I will not be disrespected in front of my audience. Then maybe, Ricky said evenly, you should stop disrespecting your guests. Try treating people with the same respect you demand from them. Wild idea, I know. That was the breaking point, Piers snapped. He barked orders at the producers, pointing furiously toward the exit. The studio erupted in chaos as crew members hesitated, unsure what to do. Get him out, Piers shouted. Get him off my set. Ricky turned calmly toward the audience, raising a hand as if to steady them. You all saw that, yeah? He said, motioning toward Piers. You saw what just happened? He couldn't handle a conversation, couldn't handle being challenged. So he's throwing me out. He paused, letting the silence hang. Remember that next time he calls himself a champion of free speech, because what he really means is free speech for him. Get out. Piers screamed, his voice cracking slightly. And Ricky did. He walked off the stage with his head high, while Piers Morgan stood alone, surrounded by silence and the wreckage of his own ego. The cameras lingered on him for a few seconds too long, long enough for everyone to see it all. The anger, the embarrassment, the dawning realization that he'd just humiliated himself, live on air. He tried to recover, straightened his jacket, forced that brittle host's smile back onto his face. But the illusion was gone. The mask had slipped. This wasn't an interview anymore. It wasn't even a debate. It was a collapse, a full televised meltdown. And the worst part for Piers was that he had no one to blame but himself. His ego, his arrogance, his obsession with control. It had all come undone before millions of witnesses. Ricky Gervais didn't just win the argument. He won the moment. The final minutes of the broadcast were painful to watch. Piers tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But the air had gone out of the room. His co-hosts avoided eye contact. The audience shifted uncomfortably. And within minutes, clips of the confrontation were already flooding social media. The internet doing what it does best. Because moments like this don't just fade. They spread. They get replayed, dissected, memed, analyzed, until they become part of the cultural bloodstream. And no matter what Piers said afterward, no matter how he tried to spin it or rewrite it, this would follow him. This was the night he proved every accusation true. The night he exposed himself as exactly what Ricky had described. A bully who only believes in free speech when he's holding the microphone. A hypocrite who demands respect while giving none. An entitled host who'd rather eject a guest than admit he might be wrong. And Ricky? Ricky walked out of that studio and straight into legend. Because standing up to bullies, especially the ones with cameras and power, always resonates. It always feels like justice, like someone finally saying what everyone else was thinking. That's what made the moment unforgettable. Not that someone was kicked off a show, but how it happened. The way the host himself proved his guest's point by losing control. The way millions watched a man's ego implode in real time. Piers Morgan did become the headline that night, just not the one he wanted.